taped. Script plus tape equals quick reference. Awesome. If Strahd is the land, then I totally understand the really tall castle towers. He's compensating for his tiny province. Today we're going to be talking about the land of Barovia as a whole. We're going to cover the size of the map, the population, some alternate history. We're going to talk about the sunsword, and be sure to stick around to the end for an alternate reason why so many Barovians don't have souls. Let's flesh out a little bit of history here. So you know what happens to a plant when it doesn't get enough sunlight, right? It withers and it dies. The same thing happens to people when they don't get enough food. They wither and they die. They starve to death. The module states that the sun never fully shines in Barovia. It's always obscured by clouds or by fog. It's like Forks, Washington, except nobody sparkles.
This is what I am.
There used to be a lot more people living in Barovia. It was green, it was verdant, it was fertile. And it was a pretty nice place to live if you didn't mind the despotic ruler. That all changed when the mists came and enshrouded everything. A lot of the plants began to die off. Not all of them, of course, but the ones that required a lot of sunlight. And the plants, the animals that depended on them, died off with them. The same thing happened for crops. The crop yields lowered. Some crops died off. And the people that depended on them, well, they started to die off too. The Barovian population began to wither and die as part of a good old-fashioned famine. This is going to become important when I come out with my revised Death House guide, so keep all that in mind for next time. Eventually, enough Barovians died that the remainder, the survivors, were able to enter into an equilibrium with their new surroundings. They were able to survive on kale and root vegetables. It wasn't great, but it was better than starving to death. At the very least, there was plenty of wine and champagne. Now that we've got the history out of the way, let's talk about the map of Barovia. So I've got it right here, and it's let's go on a field trip. Barovia in all its cartographic glory. Barovia as a whole is about 228 square miles. It's about the size of Chicago. Now, I wouldn't want to walk all the way across Chicago, but it's still not terribly big. The distance from the village of Barovia to Vallaki, for instance, is only 17.5 miles going along the Svalich Road. That's a day hike. You can get there in 3/4 of a day at a normal pace. That's not a whole lot for an adventuring party. You might be aware that this is not the first appearance of Barovia in Dungeons & Dragons lore. It's been in previous editions, it's been in novels, and in the novels Strahd Memoirs of a Vampire and The War Against Aslan, the size of Barovia is actually mentioned. It's roughly 3 times the size of what we have here in the map. So instead of 1/4 of a mile per hex, we have 3/4 of a mile per hex. This drastically changes the travel times between each settlement. You can actually find a link to a table of adjusted travel times down in the description below. But why change the distance anyway? What does it affect? What change will it make to your game? Well, there's 2 reasons to make this change. First, it changes the experience of traveling between settlements. Instead of just a day hike from one to another, it's going to take your party at least a full day to get from one to another, meaning they have to camp in the wilderness or travel through the dreaded Barovian nighttime. This is going to give you an opportunity to let them camp out in the wilderness, which is great for roleplay or great for Strahd spying with them or screwing with the party, and it lets you have the things in the night go bump. Additionally, it answers the question of why doesn't Irina and Ismark just take a cart and buggy to Vallaki? If it's 17.5 miles down the road, why not? Why not just hop in a cart and go there? But if it is 3 times that distance and you have to camp in order to get there, they're not going to risk it without the strength of an adventuring party behind them. All right, we've established that there's a crap ton of land to live in, and a lot of people died of starvation once upon a time. But how many people are actually left in Barovia? The book doesn't say exactly. It says that there's less than 3,000 people, but there's no hard count. It tells you how many folks you can find in each of the houses, but then it leaves you to actually count the houses and do the math, and that's probably not your thing. 181, 182. Ah, son of a... It's definitely not my thing, but thankfully we have previous editions that we can look back at for a reference of each settlement's population. So for the village of Barovia, we have about 500 people here. Okay, that's a pretty good sized village for Ismark to be running. For the town of Vallaki, we have about 1,500 people. It's a veritable metropolis. There's a lot of folks there. When you're wandering about during the day, don't skimp on the descriptions of people. They're out and about and they're doing their thing. Now, for the village of Krezg, we have about 2,000. What the hell, 3rd edition? Anyway, it's not a perfect reference. There's actually about, I don't know, 70 people in Krezg, if that. So that's about 2,100 NPCs living in Barovia on a daily basis, give or take. Now, how do all these people eat? What do they eat? Where do they get their food from? We know where they get their wine from, but what about everything else? This area right over here around the village of Barovia, between the village itself and the river Ivlis, that is going to be farmland. This is probably some of the most fertile and verdant land that you're going to find in Barovia, despite the mists. So when your players are traveling down this road here, go ahead and describe farmlands of hardy, dark-leafed vegetables and old rundown farmhouses. They look empty, but they are working farms. There are people that actually till the land and sow the crops and whatnot. They're probably not around, and they're definitely not welcoming to outsiders. So if your players go to explore the farms, they're going to find them barred and locked and telling them to go away. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave this here and clean it up later, and I'm going to see you guys back up in my office in just a second. Whew, okay, we're back. All right, if you want this guide in written form, with some extra content like a new random encounter, some stuff between Strahd and Irina, you can check it out on our Patreon. Anybody who pledges $1 or more gets access to this guide and all of our other ones to download and keep forever. So go ahead and check that out. We love your support. But if that's not something you can do right now, that's cool. We're happy to see you here on YouTube. Go ahead and click subscribe and hit that bell if you haven't already, so you can see us anytime we upload a new video. Let's make a small change to the sunsword now. Instead of finding the sunsword as a whole, ready to use on somebody's windowsill somewhere, have your party only find the hilt. Now the hilt is still sentient. It's got all those sentient properties you find in the book, with the addition that it really, and I mean really, wants to go to Krezg, specifically the Shrine of the White Sun. When your players arrive there eventually, they're going to encounter Sergei in another special event. Sergei's going to ask your party to pledge themselves in the fight against the darkness, and he's going to ask them to place the hilt into the pool itself. When they do that, the entire area is enshrouded in a white light, and the sunsword is whole once again. It's powered up. It is now the Barovian lightsaber. Not only does this add extra incentive for your party to go to Krezg, but it also deepens the character of Sergei. No longer is he just some NPC from the past that whisks Irina out of the game, but he actively contributes to the success of the party. You can use him as an expository tool. Your party can have a conversation with him. It can give information about the history of Barovia, the history of Strahd, whatever you want. I wrote more about this event in detail in my Krezg guide, which you can find on Patreon. Okay, let's talk about souls and shells, which, not gonna lie, kind of makes me want shells and cheese. Anyways, the module states that most of the Barovians are empty shells created by Strahd's consciousness to feed his ego. On the surface, that sounds pretty okay, but it doesn't really jive with the fact that Barovians without souls can breed and create more Barovians with souls, and vice versa. A soulful Barovian can create a soulless Barovian, and the math doesn't add up. So we've got to find some other reason that a lot of Barovians are these empty shells. I propose a much more sinister origin for these empty shells. Something is out there that is interrupting the cycle of death and rebirth. When a Barovian dies, their soul enters the ethereal plane, but it can't leave, as you already know. It just cycles around, round and round, repeatedly, until a Barovian is born that requires a soul. Then, one of the souls from the ethereal plane is plucked out, washed clean, and shoved back into a body for another lifetime under Strahd's rule. Or at least that's the way it's supposed to work. It hasn't been working quite like that for a long time now. As I've said before, the Amber Temple is leaking. The vestiges are reaching out across Barovia in search of potential victims. They enter the minds of sleepers and invade their dreams. They offer the dreamer love and happiness and all sorts of things, all in an attempt to get the sleeper to surrender their soul. When one of those Barovians dies later in life who surrendered their soul, they don't go back to the big recycling plant up in the sky. Instead, their soul is condemned to the vestige that claimed it, and it basically becomes food. That takes a soul out of the cycle of death and rebirth. Now, since there's not a whole lot of extra people coming into Barovia, this creates a bit of a supply and demand problem. So what does this mean for you and your players in practical terms? Maybe not a lot. It could just be window dressing. It could be an excuse for you to talk in a monotone voice. Or maybe it's more. If your players latch on to this idea of soulless Barovians, chances are they're going to want to solve the problem. It's going to be a quest. Now, for a quest, what do? They could go to the abbot and figure out the reason why. I'm sure the abbot would know at least a little bit about this. He could send them on an epic quest to reseal the vestiges inside the Amber Temple. How do you do that? I don't know. I haven't come up with a quest for that, but if you have something, let us know down in the comments and maybe we'll make a video out of it in the future. But aside from that, there's another problem looming on the horizon for Strahd himself. The module states that the blood of the soulless provides no nourishment for a vampire. And if the problem of soullessness is one that's growing, well, Strahd himself is facing an impending famine. Strahd knows that a lot of Barovians are soulless. He can tell on sight whether or not one has a soul and one doesn't. But he's probably not aware that it is a growing problem. What happens if he becomes aware? Strahd's a survivor, famine be damned. He's gonna figure out a way to get through this. Will he seal the Ember Temple himself? Or will he turn his attention away from Irina and towards escaping Barovia once and for all? If he does that, could this be the escape and the salvation that your party has been looking for? Could they team up with Strahd to figure out how to break down the barriers, how to get past the dark powers, and escape through the mists? Is that what they'll do? Will they save the villain in order to save themselves?